welcome to Sansad TV. I'm Rini Chaudhuri and you're watching Perspective. Prime Minister Narendra Modi chaired the Virtual G20 Leaders Summit on 22nd November 2023. Invitees included leaders of all G20 member states, including the chair of the African Union, as well as 9 guest countries and heads of 11 international organizations. At the closing session of the Leaders Summit held in the national capital on 10 September earlier this year, the Prime Minister had put forth the suggestion for a virtual summit towards the end of India's G20 presidency period. This virtual summit marks a milestone since no other G20 presidency till date has witnessed a physical meeting of all the leaders as well as a virtual one. The objective is to take forward the guidance provided by participating leaders in their interventions and also give an impetus to implementing the outcomes of the New Delhi Leaders Summit. In today's edition of Perspective, we will be discussing certain key facets of India's G20 presidency and try to understand what it means for India's own global leadership role as well as that of the G20 as a multilateral forum. Joining us in conversation are 2 eminent guests. I'm pleased to welcome Shri Yogesh Gupta, former ambassador, and Dr. Sriram Chaulia, foreign affairs expert. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. Dr. Chaulia, I begin with you. Let's start by taking stock of what has been achieved so far. What concrete steps have been taken to operationalize the key outcomes of the New Delhi summit, including the adoption of the G20 Leaders Declaration?
Well, really, Delhi Declaration is historic. It's very comprehensive, and we could achieve consensus on a wide variety of topics with a developmental focus. So the Sustainable Development Goals, women-led development, issues relevant to Global South like debt management and debt restructuring. These were, very fundamental. Multilateral development banks. So these were, I think, the big takeaways. There was also a big green climate, initiative, a new, financing mechanisms and all these that were initiated. So overall, we wanted as a host to make the G20 count for not just the G20 member countries, but for the larger Global South.
Right.
And to that extent, the deliverables are quite, very substantive. And now the question is about the commitments and how we can make the, walk the talk and make the countries who have signed on to it to fulfill the commitments. Generally, G20 commitments have been upheld by up to 70%. In most summits, right. But we would hope to raise the commitment level to higher 80 or 90% or more, so that this presidency really remains a landmark. It already is a landmark in terms of the depth and the breadth of issues that have been covered and delivered now. But the proof of the pudding is in eating it, as the saying goes. And implementation is the key always. And I think our Prime Minister's vision has been not just mere talking. We need to turn all these things into reality because people's expectations are rising, crises are rising, multilateralism is in trouble. So unless G20 delivers, there is no hope for the world. So I think that's the big message. That's why we are doing this virtual summit, to make sure that every commitment and every deliverable is achieved.
Right. Mr. Gupta, throughout its G20 presidency, India has worked consistently to ensure that the concerns of the Global South, in particular, receive due cognizance. Can you shed more light on how India's presidency has helped to advance the agenda of the Global South, particularly in terms of addressing certain issues like climate change, poverty and sustainable development that Dr. Chaulia mentioned?
If you recall, in the beginning of the year, in January itself, India had held an online summit. And at that summit, a large number of G20 a large number of developing countries had participated.
Right.
And we utilized that summit to take into account the concerns of the developing countries on these issues like debt or the issues of poverty, issues like energy, the high prices of energy, high prices of fertilizers, and so on. And the idea was to understand what the concerns of the various G20 countries were. And once we got this input at that summit, then we incorporated most of the concerns of the G20 in the larger summit declaration. And we were helped also by the other, by the predecessor country of G20 and the successor country, that is Indonesia and Brazil.
Right.
And so together, this Troika was able to put together all these concerns into the declaration. Also, we took the opportunity to add or to admit the African Union as the new member of the G20.
Absolutely.
So that was another concrete initiative. So together, we were able to incorporate most of these concerns of the G20 in the declaration, G20 declaration. And it is our expectation that Brazil will be able to carry forward from where we have left.
Right.
And, in some of these issues like climate change, for instance, the need of the G20 countries for climate finance, that's one of the important steps. That is part of the ongoing negotiations.
Right.
And a certain amount of convergence has taken place on the issue of mobilization of climate finance, though, of course, the old criteria and expectations and targets are yet to be met. But still, the developed countries are providing at least some finance for the purpose.
Right. Mr.
So
Gupta, you've mentioned the inclusion of the African Union. Dr. Chaulia, India's initiative played a key role in the inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member of the G20. What does this inclusion signify and what does it mean for the representation of developing countries in global governance as a whole?
Yeah, G20, the criticism was that it only represented a kind of confluence of big powers, rich countries, and middle powers,
right,
and rising powers like India, not the small states. I mean, G20, there are 193 other member states of the UN who are not part of, 173 other member states of the UN who are not part of G20. So there is this been criticism that it's a kind of elite multilateralism, not really multilateralism that caters to the wretched of the earth or the poorest of the poor. So it's in that context that bringing the African Union in makes a huge difference, because it's representing 55 countries, most of whom are fall under the what we call the least developed LDC, least developed countries category. So their concerns were often disregarded or sidelined. For example, what Ambassador Gupta was talking about, the price of fuel, food, fertilizer, basic, living standards that have been declining since the pandemic and the Ukraine war.
Right.
So in that kind of context, bringing the AUs in as a full member will make a difference, because they are not observers anymore. They are not somebody outside the hall and peeping in through the window. Now they have got a seat at the table. So they will be able to speak for themselves. They have been empowered because of India's inclusive multilateralism mantra. The Africans have now been empowered, and now they feel like they don't need to beg more advanced countries for their rights, because now they can demand it and they can actually vote. Once you are a full member, G20 operates on negative consensus, which means even if one member country is not agreeing, then you don't get a final communique or a final outcome. So what it means is, for the first time, the African Union can actually have a kind of a veto on policies or on agreements that do not fulfill the aspirations of the poorest of the poor.
Right.
So I think these are huge, it's not just symbolic, it's actually changing the contours of multilateralism. Multilateralism has not delivered, is in crisis because it was not representative. And now, through Prime Minister's initiative, we have been able to bring the African Union in, which makes it more representative, more equitable, and more inclusive. I think we have democratized the international institutions through this big step.
Right. Ambassador Gupta, coming back to you, Dr. Chaulia mentioned India's mantra of inclusive multilateralism. And indeed, India has played a crucial role in bridging differences among G20 members to arrive at consensus on key issues. How do you think India's approach has contributed to strengthening multilateral cooperation as we understand it? And what does this mean for the future of G20 in the years ahead?
Well, we have, I think, played a very positive role in trying to trying to promote convergence on various issues. And India's presidency was particularly useful because we were able to get a declaration by consensus on the most trickier issues. And mind you, this time the situation was much different from the Bali declaration in November last year, because the rivalry between the United States and China had accelerated, after the balloon incident. And they were not seeing eye to eye on some of these kind of issues like the Middle East or the issue of Ukraine or other issues, because there are increasing differences. But despite these differences, we were able to bring them together, not only on these issues, but even others like climate change, for instance, climate change, terrorism, and so on. So I think that was a very positive and a very important contribution made by India of getting the declaration by consensus at the New Delhi summit.
Absolutely.
And it was recognized by the world leaders, including by President Biden and so on, that India had played a critical role. And mind you, India was able to enlist the cooperation of not only the countries of the global south, but also the industrialized or the developed countries. So India had emerged as a leader of, who had played a role in this convergence between the East and the West and the North and the South, as they say. So I think this was a very, very important development.
Right. Dr. Chaulia, India held over 200 meetings in 60 cities across the country over the course of its year-long G20 presidency. What do you think is the significance of this expansive outreach with focus on such diverse regions?
Well, first of all, I think our idea was to increase our own people's stakeholdership and partnership in global governance.
Right.
India is 1.4 billion people. So, and you mentioned 60 cities. The total number of people who have been Indian citizens who are engaged in G20 processes is more than 15 million, either as direct participants or as audiences or, being involved in the organization of these events.
Right.
So what we're talking about and what we did was basically increase the awareness of global issues and of India's rising stature in the eyes and the minds of ordinary Indians. It's very important because as a country rises and becomes a major power, India is destined to become a great power or a leading power. And for that, we need our citizens to have a sense of being part of this project of India's rise in the world. Our citizens should not feel like this is some big foreign policy or global talk that's going on, which is not relevant to my daily lives. So we showed the connection between our G20 leadership and how it matters to the lives of ordinary people, ordinary Indians, in concrete material terms and also in terms of our stature and rising status and the sense of pride and nationalism that it invokes in our country among ordinary people. So I think this was necessary I would say it's a milestone in India's rise as a leading power, because this presidency, the 1 year, 2023, what it did was it heightened a kind of self-awareness among ordinary Indians.
Right.
That yes, we are leaders and that we can solve problems. I think that gives you also a sense of responsibility. Prime Minister has been saying the Amrit Kaal, the next 25 years, is a time of responsibilities, and India is willing to shoulder more and more global responsibilities, and that can only come with the buy-in from the society. It's not just a top level thing where the government is taking responsibility on behalf of India. People of India are taking responsibility, and we ensured that by making this such a deep-rooted process, our presidency was, it's like an osmosis. It went and seeped into the hearts and minds of ordinary Indians, and I think that is a huge achievement.
Right. And Dr. Chaulia, that's a very pertinent point also, because during the course of India's presidency of G20, the term People's G20 also gained ground. And indeed, as you put it, that it's an osmosis of India's sense of leadership, and it is truly a reflection of India's enhanced role on the global stage. Mr. Gupta, the 9th G20 Parliamentary Speakers Summit, or the P20, was also hosted by India in October this year. Can you elaborate on the importance of interparliamentary cooperation in furthering the G20 agenda?
Yes, the parliaments play a very critical role in formulating the agenda in their respective countries, because after all, they are the symbols of the representatives of people who are expected to be familiar with the concerns of the people in their respective constituencies. So the parliaments are able to define the agenda, and through discussions and deliberations, then these agendas are approved by the parliament, and then which form part of the policies of the respective government. So it was very important that the policies of the member countries are sort of approved at the level of parliament, and then these are incorporated in the declaration, G20 declaration. And like the G20 declaration of September, the declaration of the parliaments next month was similarly able to encapsulate all these discussions on critical issues, political issues like Ukraine or the rivalries between the US and China, and issues like terrorism, issues like climate change, debt, other economic issues of economic development, and so on. Right. And they were able to work out a common declaration like earlier, which was a very major advance or a major development for the parliaments, for the G20 parliaments, because that showed that at the level of parliaments, at the level of the institutions of the people, there was consensus among the G20 countries. And this emergence of consensus and incorporation of consensus in the declaration that helped us in conveying a very positive signal to the world that the G20 countries, including their parliaments, are able to stand together on these issues which are concerning the people of the world.
Right. Dr. Chaulia, in the light of ongoing global challenges, what would you say are the most pressing priorities for the G20 moving forward?
Well, I think how to depoliticize basic, livelihood and developmental needs. I think that's a fundamental problem, because what has been happening is, because of the ongoing wars and the weakness of the international institutions, people are weaponizing food, fuel, fertilizer, access to basic services. All these are being weaponized by various armed actors. So I think, big powers are also involved in these wars, and we have a breakdown of the norms of rules-based order and all these things. So in this kind of situation, the G20 will need to continue to stick to the developmental agenda that India has shown light on. And the G20 needs to try and pursue the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which have all fallen back. There have been severe setbacks in the last 3-4 years since the pandemic started, right. And now with the wars. So we have to actually cocoon the poor in our own individual countries, but also outside G20 globally, from the shocks which are reverberating. And we are in what some international institutions are saying, we are in an era of polycrisis, meaning there are multiple economic and geopolitical crises which are intersecting and leading to a lot of disruption, chaos, and violence and suffering. So I think the G20 has its task cut out. Of course, the G20 is quite clear that it will not go into peacemaking and trying to resolve armed conflicts, which is a problem. But then they have a clear agenda of global economic governance, and economic governance, sustaining growth, and making sure that people are emerge from this long spell of this polycrisis. I think that's a fundamental challenge for G20 going forward. The presidencies that are coming, Brazil, South Africa, and right. Then possibly the United States again, we have, we are coming one full circle, one full round of all the summits are completing. Once you have 20 summits, the 21 summits, we're going to again start from block one again, from square one. So in a way, it's 2 decades of G20 or 20 summits will show you that what we have achieved and where we go forward. So I think the global scenario is grim. And G20 has to deliver, because if they don't, then there's nothing else to hold the world from collapsing.
Right. Ambassador Gupta, we are talking about the presidencies which are set to take the stage after India. And in fact, during India's presidency, we had the Troika comprising Indonesia, India and Brazil, all of which were in fact voices of the Global South. And going ahead, we will have India, Brazil and South Africa comprising the Troika, which again represent developing countries. What do you think this means for the developing countries at large, and how will this help to shape the agenda of G20 and to reinforce the idea of multilateralism going ahead?
As my colleague Dr. Cholia was just mentioning, we are entering into a world which is much more anarchic, where the rivalries between the US and China are increasing. Certain regional powers are sort of acting on their own, and their activities are leading to greater conflicts and so on. So developing countries are most vulnerable from these global conflicts or these regional conflicts. Then we have pandemics, as we have witnessed recently, the COVID pandemic. And then we have other major policy changes taking place, both at the political and economic level.
Right.
For instance, the rising interest rates in the West, the rising inflation, which gets exported to the developing countries. So in the world that we are witnessing, we are going to have all these challenges. And then, of course, there are activities of these NGOs and these stateless entities, which at times adds to the conflict. So at the time of all these conflicts which are taking place, I think the G20 can play a very important role in terms of addressing the concerns of the developing countries. The presidency of India has shown the way forward. That we can negotiate a declaration, we can negotiate positions on various issues, where the concerns of developing countries can also be included effectively. So, depending on how our successor presidents like Brazil and South Africa, we hope that they will similarly be able to add the voice of the developing countries on these critical issues, both political or economic, climate change, relating to health, and so on. And they will be able to effectively bring their concerns onto the table, and then in the declaration, like India has done. So it's a very critical, very important responsibilities. And of course, we will play a helping hand. India will give a helping hand.
Right.
But a more important role will have to be played by the concerned president of the G20. Right. And we hope that since we were able to work together with them, they will similarly be able to work together with others.
Absolutely. Dr. Cholia, one last question to you before we wrap up. As we draw the curtains on India's presidency of the G20, as Ambassador Gupta mentioned, India will, of course, continue to be in a position of hand-holding to the incoming presidencies. But going ahead at a time when we are wrapping up our own, duration of spearheading this body, how do you think India will continue to align its national priorities and areas of interest with the larger global agenda for development?
Well, India, we have champions at delivering on our own commitments, be it on climate, be it on renewable energy.
Right.
Whatever we have internationally committed, we have, surpassed the global expectations.
Right.
So what that means is that India's word has value. It's not just a cheap talk. So I think by example, we are leading through creative diplomacy, through, by being this bridge between East and West, North and South. We are seeing that in G20. But even going forward, by example, the kind of economic development that we are doing in our own country, the kind of financial inclusion we are doing for the poor, those are big models. The kind of digital means by which we are delivering governance. All these are phenomenally successful. Many G20 countries want to learn from us.
Right.
And not to mention other non-G20 member countries which are poorer and less technologically advanced. So I think India will have to lead through example, and of course we will continue to facilitate multilateral diplomacy. So through action and through deliberation, I think India will lead the way.
Right. Thank you, gentlemen. Action and deliberation, as we summarize, will indeed be the way forward as we come to an end of India's G20 presidency with the end of November. And going ahead, there will be new challenges, but the world, led by the G20 and countries coming together, will certainly come together to find a way ahead. That's it for this edition of Perspective.